According to the Hebrew Bible or the Torah, Israelite history begins with Abraham. The Torah tells a story starting in Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy. And that story is one in which God covenants with a certain people as God chooses that people. And in return, that people has to do certain kinds of things for God. This is a kind of covenant that's based on ancient Near Eastern covenants that were often made between vassals and kings. According to the story, though, right, the Israelites come out of their original land, the land of Canaan, later to be the land of Israel, that is promised to the children of Israel. They go to Egypt, they come back, they inherit the land with God's help, and then they set up their polity in Jerusalem. And that comes a little bit later, after the Torah is over. The Torah's story is hard to evaluate as actual history. It seems mythic. That is, it's a kind of sacred history, a story that people tell over time to recount their own origins. And it's a little bit unclear to what extent any of this or how much of this is actually based in fact. What we do know is that there was in fact an Israelite polity. We're not sure if it started before King David, around the time of King David, of whom we have a little bit of external evidence existed, about the year 1000 BCE, or afterwards. But afterwards, certainly, by the years 900 to 800 BCE, we do have a community that consider themselves to be Israelites. Now that community is based both in the south, there's one section in Judah with its capital of Jerusalem, and in the north, and that is the community of Israel. Israel itself is destroyed in the late 8th century, and the refugees from Israel come down into Judah and into Jerusalem. And it's that combined community of the Judahites and the original northern Israelites, the northern kingdom, that create the community out of which much of the literature that would become biblical kind of emerges. That community is based on this notion of covenant where the Israelites sacrifice animals to God. So it's a sacrificial system. The sacrificial system is based, or is supposed to be based, in Jerusalem, at the Jerusalem temple. And that at this time is called the First Temple. So that's a temple that's probably built sometime in the 10th century BCE, and it's going to last until the 6th century BCE. So the way in which Israelites kind of keep good with God is to offer regular sacrifices. Now this changes quite dramatically in some ways in 586 BCE, when that temple is actually destroyed by the Babylonians. The Israelites, seeking first to understand how it is that their temple could be destroyed when they've been making regular sacrifices to God, that is, why didn't their God protect them, develop all kinds of theories of theodicy as the questions of God's justice. One answer, of course, could have been that their God was less powerful. Their God was simply defeated. That's an unacceptable answer. So instead, they came up with an answer that it's because they sinned. They sinned. They may have offered the sacrifice, but they didn't do so with the right spirit, with the right other kinds of ethical behavior. And as a result, the Babylonians were appointed by God to come and destroy their temple. Now, the Babylonians actually took many of them and deported them to Babylonia itself. And it's during this time when you have a kind of court in exile, because the Babylonians would often take the elites of countries that they conquered and repatriate them to other places so that they would have far fewer opportunities to foment more revolt. So in Babylonia, right, you have a kind of Israelite court in exile between the years 586 and maybe the middle of the 5th century. In this kind of court in exile, there seems to have been the formation of what we know as the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Old Testament. These terms don't exactly mean the same thing, and we'll get into that issue later in the course. But what they seem to do is to take these different documents, these different texts that emerge out from before 586, and condense them into coherent books. So the Torah we call a redacted text. It's a text that's made from other documents that some editor has spliced together, and that text, of course, is mainly in Hebrew with some Aramaic. Later on, it will be translated into Aramaic and into Greek. In Greek form, it's known as the Septuagint. There's this period of time then from about the 5th century BCE, which is when Israelites actually are able to return to the land of Israel. And when they return to the land of Israel, namely the area around Jerusalem, they seem to pick up this other name of Jew, Yehudi. So you begin to see the formation of a somewhat new identity beginning with that return. Also in that return, they rebuild the temple. That temple, starting in about 540 BCE and lasting to 70 CE, is known as the Second Temple. During that period of time, Jews both reinstituted the sacrificial system that the Israelites had originally practiced, but also there seemed to be some kind of rising role given to this new text, the Tanakh, or at least the pieces of the Tanakh as they circulated. Now, exactly what kind of role they played in the religious life of whether individuals or the entire community is a little bit uncertain. But certainly some parts of that community would take these texts, and especially the Torah, seriously. At the same time, there are Jews outside of the land of Israel. Whether they're in Egypt, many Jews remained in Babylonia. Those Jews are called, that area outside of the land of Israel is often referred to as the diaspora, right? That's the Jews that are kind of spread out of the homeland. A lot of this changes now again in 70 CE. So if one watershed moment is 586 BCE, another watershed moment is 70 CE. And that's with the Roman destruction of the Second Temple. It's at that time that we begin to see the rise of the rabbis. There are no rabbis as we kind of usually understand the word prior to 70 CE. Only afterwards do they develop. And there's actually a lot of scholarly debate over why the rabbis developed then. One traditional narrative is that with the destruction of the temple, there's no spiritual leadership, so the rabbi just fills that vacuum. Personally, I think that's not correct, that there is spiritual leadership that continues to the extent that anybody needed spiritual leadership in a kind of world that's governed by custom. That is, what it is that one's parents or one's community does, that's what kind of reigned, and one didn't need a lot of spiritual authority, but priests are still around. With the destruction of the temple, it doesn't mean that priests who would offer the sacrifices in the temple weren't around. In fact, they were, and they were scattered around, and they could well have been serving this role. In any case, rabbis begin to arise in Palestine and in Babylonia, and probably they exist as kind of small, elite disciple circles, right? Not tightly organized, loosely networked. So out of that time, under kind of Roman occupation in Palestine, and by then Babylonia had fallen to the Persians, under Persian occupation in Babylonia, these two rabbinic circles kind of created this foundational literature. Now, that foundational literature was in a way challenged, as well it should have been, or at least as well as one would have expected. Because the literature of the rabbis is a literature that goes well beyond the text of the Torah or the Tanakh. It starts there, but it decontextualizes it, it interprets it, it adds to it, it creates out of this literature of ancient Israel a new understanding that becomes Judaism. Now that issue, it creates a tension between this vision of the rabbis and their kind of expansive but elite notion of what Judaism is, and this foundational text of the Torah comes to a head in the early Middle Ages in the period that we know as the Gaonic period. The Gaonim are the rabbis of that period as they're known. They begin to become more institutionalized. They begin to establish academies, and they gain, under now Islamic rule, a certain sense of authority granted to them by the ruling powers. That challenge comes in the form of the Karaites. The Karaites look at the rabbinic literature, and they basically say, what's that? We have the religion of the Torah, religion of the Bible, that's fine, but what are the rabbis doing in changing that into this more expansive form? The Karaites mounted a serious challenge to the rabbis. And it was a challenge that took a couple of centuries to fully resolve. And when it was, they lost. Because it turns out in part that the Karaites, their stance that you can have a religion based only on Torah is an impossible stance. They too needed to expand in terms of thinking through how it is that you actually live the limited, kind of short and cryptic commands that you find in the Torah. This is a moment that we could call the victory of rabbinic Judaism in the Gaonic period. And the last serious challenge, perhaps until the modern period, in the Karaites is eliminated. From then on, we can talk about the community of Jews as basically dividing into two or perhaps even three different communities. One is the Ashkenazic community. So that's the community that begins in Germany in the Middle Ages, and that ultimately, through a series of expulsions and pogroms, is driven primarily east, although some come back. And that community is the community that's in Eastern Europe, and that creates the basis of the immigration, the great Jewish immigration to America in the beginning of the 20th century and late 19th century. That's a community that speaks Yiddish, or that had Yiddish as its language. Yiddish was a kind of High German from the Middle Ages that is interlaced with Hebrew and written in Hebrew characters. Sephardic Jews begin their life in Spain, Sepharad in Hebrew. And it's from Spain, when they're expelled, that they go out into the Netherlands, into the New World. The Sephardic Jews become the first settlers in the colonies, the American colonies, and are by far the more dominant kind of Jew in the American colonies through probably the middle of the 19th century. And they have their own language, like Yiddish, called Ladino. Ladino is a kind of Spanish that's written in Hebrew characters and used within that community. I said maybe a third community because one can separate from these two communities a kind of what's called a Mizrahi community or an Eastern community, primarily located in the Iraq-Iran region. These communities developed certain customs that are different. Right? They spoke these different languages. They had a set of different liturgy. For most people familiar with the tradition, they can make out some of these differences because there is a common base in the rabbinic tradition. But at the same time, right, they develop these kind of local variations to the extent that at times it's very hard to follow, let's say, some of the liturgy, moving from one congregation to the other. During this period of time, also, during the Middle Ages, it's important to notice two developments. One is the development of Jewish philosophy, or theology. We're going to return to this, but it's at this time that you begin to see the first real works of Jewish theology emerge, often in the form of what we might call a philosophy. So people like Maimonides or Chasdai Crescus, or there are a whole series of such figures begin to write philosophies to make Jewish customs systematic and intelligible. A second is mysticism. Jewish mysticism, especially embodied in the Zohar, is a way of making the system, as it were, into a myth. The Torah becomes a coded myth of the nature of God. So out of the Middle Ages emerged this new literature of philosophy and mysticism. Now, when you get to the 17th and 18th centuries especially, and then into the 19th century, we begin to see the move of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is going to affect different Jewish communities in different ways. So in Germany, for example, the Enlightenment was very strong, and Jews immediately found a way into it and to latch onto it as something that would gain them an increased role within the wider Jewish community. That is, the problem is this. If the Enlightenment claims that all human beings are created equal, all human beings shouldn't be discriminated against, then Jews have in fact earned themselves, or Jews simply by who they are, deserve a seat at the table. They deserve civic rights. And this was actually quite an important feud within the German community of the 18th and 19th centuries. Do they grant Jews emancipation, as the ability to vote, or not? And a lot of that hinged in the question of, is Judaism a rational religion, or isn't it? By rational, of course, they meant something like Protestantism. So it's within that context, in Germany at least, that philosophical tradition of the Middle Ages comes to fruition, in that later Jewish German thinkers recreate Judaism, right, as a system that looks a little bit more like Protestantism. It's rational, right? It's systematic. One can explain its kind of peculiar or distinct rituals and customs in a way that makes sense to a German and to an increasingly assimilated Jewish community. So that's one way in which the Enlightenment and emancipation plays out. But in Eastern Europe, it's a little bit different. In Eastern Europe doesn't really fully get the Enlightenment and the emancipation in the same way that Western Europe does. And there we have the flowering of that tradition of mysticism in the Zohar. That comes out in Hasidism. So Hasidism is the idea that Judaism should be joyful, and that joy is somehow brought to fruition with a more mystical and less rational approach. Hasidic groups tended to form around a central leader. That central leader is seen as a tzaddik. A tzaddik is and is not a rabbi. He is a rabbi in the respect that he's kind of often learned, often ordained as a rabbi, but he's not a rabbi in that he has a special connection to God. So it is through the tzaddik that the Hasidic members of his group saw themselves as gaining primary access to God. So Hasidism was one kind of response to modernity. In Eastern Europe, modernity had brought a kind of intellectualism into the Jewish yeshivot, the learning academies, and that became fairly dominant among the Judaism of these Eastern European villages and cities. Hasidism was a response. It said that actually we don't have to be so rational, that rationalism takes some of the joy and the pleasure out. And in fact, we can restore that with the tzaddik and the use of mysticism and so on. If we go back to Germany, though, in the West, we have a different set of responses to modernity. There, it began with the Reform movement. All three of the major movements of Judaism that we have today, Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative, had their origins in 19th century Germany. The Reform movement was the first, and it was begun by a group of Jews who said, in response to this German emphasis on the rationality of religion, that yes, there were in fact certain parts of their traditional practice that can be brought more into the spirit of the day and the spirit of Judaism as they understood it. These were the reforms, and at first they were relatively minor. So they began, for example, with adding an organ to the service on the Sabbath. The use of musical instruments previously had been forbidden for use on the Sabbath. Or giving the sermon in German rather than in Yiddish. As time went on, of course, these changes grew, and they encompassed a number of different kinds of changes that, again, aimed to make things more understandable for the age in which they lived. That, though, was met by a reaction by another group of Jews in Germany. And that reaction can be termed the Orthodox or the modern Orthodox movement, and its beginnings under Samson Raphael Hirsch. So that group said, of course, Jews can live as full Germans and as full Jews, but nevertheless, they can do so within a context that is more traditional. So it's from that you have an emphasis on a systematic presentation of Judaism and understanding of Judaism, founded on certain kinds of traditional laws with a certain idea about how law evolves. But yet, with people who on the street might look exactly like anybody else. They don't dress distinctively necessarily. They don't act distinctively. They just are a group of Jews who are also Germans. In between these two groups, a third group developed, and that became known as the conservative movement. That movement articulated a kind of mid-course position that says that tradition actually was very important, but that tradition changes according to the time. Now that's a position that is at least explicitly rejected by the Orthodox. There is tradition and it's timeless. But conservative Judaism grew around that idea, that Judaism does have to follow Jewish law, halakha, but that halakha evolves. Whereas now on the other side of the spectrum, Reform Judaism began to articulate increasingly a position that there is no binding halakha, there is no binding law. Although, of course, Jews can choose to observe whatever it is that they wanted to observe, they are not bound by some external force to do so. The only American movement, interestingly enough, that emerged, and that emerged in the 20th century, was Reconstructionism. And Reconstructionism is founded on an idea that Judaism is actually based in culture, or the folk ways of the Jewish people. Now, Reconstructionism, too, has changed over time. Those folk ways have been infused with a kind of neo-Hasidic spirit in many congregations, but not all congregations. And the Reconstructionist movement, right, is fairly diffuse in terms of its presentation of a coherent Judaism. There are two more major historical events that have to be grappled with to understand kind of where Judaism is today. And the first is the Holocaust. So it's not simply the murder of 6 million Jews, mainly in Europe, but how it is that that's dealt with. Is when Jews come back and look at the Holocaust, in a sense, what they're also doing is thinking about this in the long historical progression of the Jewish community and how it is, right, that Jews have dealt with other catastrophes in the past. The Holocaust is a kind of traumatic challenge, especially in the notion of theodicy. Yet how does a good God allow something like that to happen if this God is at all involved? And that has very much weighed on Jewish thinkers to the present day, and it's weighed on the Jewish community in terms of its response. Do you respond to the Holocaust by saying Hitler shouldn't get a posthumous victory, and in fact Judaism needs to live? Or do you respond to it with the opposite idea, which is that the Holocaust shows that God is dead and that there is no really good religious response to it? So this, again, creates a kind of spectrum of responses. One piece of that response that's always intricately linked to it is that of the emergence of the modern state of Israel in 1948. So the modern state of Israel emerges from the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement begins well before the Holocaust in the 19th century. That is also a response to modernity, a response namely to the German and Central and Western European notion that Jews don't belong in their culture. And to that, you begin to have this movement that, well, okay, if we as Jews don't belong in that culture, we need our own state, our own nation in which we can live. That nation may or may not be the historic land of Israel. Ultimately, that becomes a battle within the Zionist movement, and the people who wish it to be in the land of Israel win. But Zionism itself wasn't necessarily linked to that as a kind of modern political rather than a religious movement. However, the Holocaust, in a sense, was a catalyst for the Zionists now to gain a state for Jews in the land of Israel. And that's the modern state of Israel. Both the Holocaust and the modern state of Israel are locuses of modern Jewish identity, although not the only locuses. And Jews in the modern period and the modern Jewish condition can't be understood without also taking into account the role played by the Holocaust and the creation of the modern state of Israel.